I've just watched the Telegraph's interview with historian Andrew Roberts, of all people, who wrote his own biography of Winston Churchill, of course, which is quite different. And at the beginning of the interview, they simply ask him, was Winston Churchill racist? To which he, of course, replies that he absolutely was not. So I thought it would be only fair that I extend the same courtesy to you. So was Winston Churchill, in fact, a racist?
Not only was he a racist, but actually he never bothered to even deny it, because he knew perfectly well that colonialism and British rule in Africa and parts of Asia was based, one of the central ideologies of it was white superiority. He and others like him, he wasn't alone, but they made no bones about being a superior civilization and effectively a racist. But the fact, what is interesting is that a historian such as Andrew Roberts, for whom I have no respect whatsoever, is in fact denying it. I mean, most intelligent Churchill historians who don't, most of whom wouldn't agree with me, would not deny that. And there's some good books out there on Churchill. Clive Ponting's biography of many years ago was very good. And the more recent books published, likewise, they don't hide this. So the fact that Roberts is sort of still attempting to hide it, the only good thing one can say about that is that he realizes now that racism is not a good thing.
If we explore this a little bit further, because his answers are absolutely fascinating, presented with many quite damning quotes, you mention many of them in your book. Roberts says that the following: the fact that Churchill said things that were derogatory to people of other races does not make him somebody who wants bad things to happen to people of other races, which is what a racist is. This seems like Olympic level acrobatics of sorts. No, you can say horribly racist stuff and yet you're still not actually a racist. Anyway, he further states that Churchill was simply a product of his time, during which there was a quote unquote scientific belief that there's a hierarchy of races and that, of course, white people are on top. People often say that we shouldn't judge past leaders with the moral standards of our time. So was Churchill's racism kind of startling even for his own time?
It was, and a number of conservative colleagues of his later denounced him in the 40s and even early 50s for his racism. I mean, his refusal to accept the idea of independence for India now seems completely loony. But to some, it was loony even at the time. I mean, there's absolutely no reason why an independent settlement couldn't have been negotiated with India in the 20s or 30s prior to the Second World War. So most intelligent people accept that, his flaws were many and went quite deep. But the fact that the British propaganda machine uses Andrew Roberts to heighten the cult of Churchill makes it all the more necessary to have alternative books so that people can. I'm not saying stop reading Roberts. I'm not one of those people who advises people not to read books. So read it carefully, but then read other books that are around as well, including mine, to try and get as complete a picture as you can. Roberts is, now part of the Churchill industry. He can't be taken seriously.
What were some of the most glaring examples of Churchill's racism?
Well, racism was linked very much with Britain's colonial role, first in North America, and then as they were driven out by their former allies. In India, they moved on to India, occupying India from 1757 to, so that's when they started, to 1947, occupying parts of Africa which wouldn't give them their freedom, organizing mega tortures and gulag type camps in Kenya, for instance, which is more known about, but which many historians, including serious historians, have tended to ignore. So racism shouldn't be taken, in my opinion, as something that was isolated from the way in which Britain governed the world. I mean, it started with the Native Americans. I mean, Churchill said that the Red Indians, as he called them, had no right to their land. No more right to their land than the blacks in Australia, how he referred to the Aboriginals, or the Palestinian Arabs in Palestine. I mean, it's very consistent that Western white race Europeans had the right to conquer the world because they had a superior civilization. And so this was part of the theory of Western civilization being the model for the rest of the world, which the rest of the world doesn't accept today at all, as we see in the Ukraine war, but which many didn't accept at the time. I mean, to say to China, with a civilization going back 2,000 years, and similarly, to a lesser extent, Indian civilization in its early years was incredibly educative and important, despite all flaws. So the fact that the West became dominant, first militarily, then in colonial imperial terms, and then ideologically, is a sign of the fact that their economic model became very dynamic. Capitalism became very dynamic and started trading with the rest of the world. Trade required the construction of armies to protect the trade, navies to protect the trade routes. Later, occupation of countries became vital to make sure that no other power could take the trade away from these continents. The United States took over South America and kept the European powers out of it, saying it's our backyard, stay out. And so Britain, France concentrated on Africa and Asia. Indonesia was taken by the Dutch. I mean, it's a systematic pattern. Britain was the most successful and the most experienced of these powers.
You quote an anecdote in the book. I forgot who Winston Churchill is talking to, but I think it's quite during his later years. Maybe it's during the Second World War, where he says that even after the war, we have to uphold white supremacy.
Yeah.
Could you talk a bit more about that?
Well, he did say all this, and he believed it. You know, he wasn't like one of these modern politicians who say one thing one day and another thing the next. In order to stay in power. I mean, you know, from his own point of view, he was quite a consistent believer in the empire. For him, the most important thing in the world was the British Empire. And purely from his point of view and the conservative point of view, this was not such a wrong assessment. And now everyone disagrees with it. At the time, the Labour Party was for empire as well. And I always tell people this, that it wasn't just the Conservatives who maintained the empire. Labour did it. After all, in 1945, when Labour won the election and defeated Churchill, it was perfectly possible for them to dismantle the empire. They had no option but to do so in India because there were uprisings, strikes, huge movements for freedom and independence in India. But they could have also, why didn't they hang on to Africa? Why did they hang on to the Middle East, which created further problems for the people in those countries? So the British Empire was inscribed into the fabric of English and Scottish society, and it went very deep. And Churchill was shameless about defending this state of affairs. And, as you can see from my book, I'm a sort of very staunch critic of him. But I understand what he was doing. And simply to say racism isn't enough.
Hmm.
That was just taken for granted. I mean, the whole of British society was very racist in the days of empire. There are a handful of very brave people, workers and intellectuals, who did start to raise questions. But as for those who ran Britain, the politicians and the military and the court, these three elements in British society, they were very strongly for the empire.
All right, first and foremost, a massive, massive thank you to my patrons, aka producers, Jurechuk, Mila, Veronica, Carmen, and Taichi. You legends rock. Without you, this podcast would not have been possible. Thank you so much. For the rest of you, if you enjoyed listening to this episode, please do follow on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and subscribe on YouTube. That would be a big help. And of course, if you want to become a patron to go on Patreon, find me there and become one. All right. Thanks.